rolls in. Welcome everyone. Welcome back to another session in our spring Water Resources Research Center seminar series. And this week we have Mia Comeros and Chris Shuler presenting on integrated ridge to reef studies in American Samoa. Just to introduce our speakers, so originally from Cebu, Philippines, Mia Comeros serves as the Water Resources Research Center Red Hill Project Coordinator and researcher at the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Management. Her research interests include ridge to reef ecological processes, coral reef fish ecology and fisheries, water quality, and watershed management. Mia is currently a PhD candidate at James Cook University, and she has previously served as a research scientist for the American Samoa Environmental Protection Agency and as the IUCN Red List Research Associate for the Marine Biodiversity Unit. And Chris Shuler is currently an affiliate researcher at WRRC at the University of Hawaii, and he has a PhD in geology and geophysics, specializing in hydrology from UH, and a BS in environmental science from the University of Oregon, as well as a post-baccalaureate certification in environmental education from the University of Minnesota Duluth. Chris's current research is focused on ground and surface water resources in Hawaii and American Samoa. So before I turn it over to the speakers, just want to let our director, Tom Jambaluka, give some opening remarks as well.
Thank you, Carrie. And thanks everyone for joining us. Really happy to have two of our really important members of the Water Resources Research Center, OHANA, here to present today. And I would just add, I'm not sure everyone knows this, but Water Resources Research Center is we're one of 54 similar water centers across the US, but we're one of only two that has more than one jurisdiction. And so our jurisdictions are Hawaii, of course, and the other one is American Samoa. So we're particularly interested in water issues in American Samoa, and I'm eager to hear more about the experiences that Mia and Chris have had doing research in American Samoa. So I'll just turn it back over to Carrie.
I'll just go ahead and let our speakers take it away from here.
Thanks so much, Carrie. Thanks so much, Tom. And thank all of you for coming out today. Taloha lava, aloha. Yeah, so thanks for coming out and your interest in our talk. So can you back up one slide, Mia? I do want to mention, so this is our title slide, and we have kind of a ridiculous laundry list of collaborators on the bottom of it. But I do want to really, just highlight that we, very intentionally put that there to, show the huge amount of assistance and contribution from all of these people who really helped co-produce the science that we're going to talk about today, as well as the agencies and organizations. Some of their logos are on the right-hand side of the screen there. All of them were integral in kind of co-producing this science. And I do apologize too. I'm sure that we've left some people and agencies off of the list. I apologize for that. But the point being is that all of this work that we're talking about, really the thread here, besides it, pertaining to water security and resilience, is that these projects were developed through partnership. So next slide, please. Just a little bit of background on me and just kind of how we came to this talk, really, about water security and resilience. So I did get my master's and my PhD in water from the Water Resources Research Center. And as Tom was saying, we are one of the institutes that has two jurisdictions, American Samoa being one of them. Although in, I think, 2013, the previous administration of the Water Resources Research Center didn't really know that. And they hadn't really done any work in American Samoa. So I was hired on as a graduate student in 2013. Nobody had really done much work in Samoa. Nobody really knew much about it. So they just kind of said, do you want to go down to American Samoa and study groundwater? And I said, where's American Samoa? So that's kind of how I started off. And I went down there and had the great fortune to just start working with American Samoa Power Authority, ASPA, right off the bat, sampling groundwater wells. And that connection really, it was was really useful for our research, but at the same time, the Power Authority, the folks there, they didn't really even look at us as outsiders. We were just kind of random graduate students, but they kind of, took us in, and it sounds cheesy, but kind of took us into the ANGA, or the Ohana of American Samoa Power Authority. And, we weren't just doing this research as, isolated people from the university, but we were part of the ASPA team, helping to contribute information to what they needed. And, they were very open and outgoing with the data that they would share, and all of the help that they provided to us on our studies. And so that, that kind of perspective of, essentially partnership and collaboration, I really was able to start with that in my graduate studies, and then brought that back a number of times visiting American Samoa. And, I think it was the second trip over there when I, was working with American Samoa EPA, kind of in the same kind of collaborative way. And that's where I met Mia, who was the chief research scientist at EPA at that time. So I'll turn it over to her to introduce herself.
Great, thank you so much, Talofa Lava and Aloha Mai Kako. So like Chris, American Samoa has also played an important part in my research journey. First, as a public servant working for the territorial American EPA, for the territorial government, and then as the focal area, research area for my PhD. And so these experiences have helped prepare me for my current role here at the Water Resources Research Center as the Red Hill Research Project Coordinator. And so we're, in this capacity, I am part of a team along with Chris, looking at critical research needs and water security and resilience issues in Hawaii and the US affiliated Pacific Islands. And so this afternoon, Chris and I are just really excited to share a top story about our collective experiences working on water quality and water quantity issues from the lens of American Samoa, and bringing it out and how these issues in the territory can have broader implications for this important issue of water security in the region. And so the outline of this talk. So first, we'll talk about the unique challenges facing Hawaii and the US API. So when we talk about the US, the Hawaii Pacific Islands region, we're talking about American Samoa, as we've mentioned, and then the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, Republic of Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, Wake, Johnson Atolls, and Howland, and all these islands. And so we start with, from that lens, what are the inherent challenges? So as islands, there are inherent vulnerabilities stemming from isolation, unique biodiversity, and also we want to highlight that there's this strong interconnectivity between land, sea, and people. And so from this, island context, we discussed the challenges to water resources, human well-being, economic and food security in the US Pacific Islands region. And so we'll look at examples of water security challenges and opportunities in American Samoa, using American Samoa as a case study. And finally, we'll talk about how these integrated watershed management lessons can be leveraged to enhance scientific support and really advance cross-Pacific collaborations in Hawaii and the US API. So first, we'll define water security. And from the perspective of this talk, we define water security and envision water security using the UN Waters definition. And so here are the 4 pillars. And so we follow these 4 pillars. So first, water security is highlighting the safeguarding the importance of having access to clean and safe water for drinking and human well-being. That's the first basis. It's a basic human right to have access to clean water and sanitation. And then water security in our mind, in our envisioning, is also having adequate water supplies and access to these clean drinking water supplies to promote human well-being, economic activities, and development. And then moving on this lower quadrant on the left, building resilience to water-related crisis and climate hazards and protection from those hazards. And then lastly, water security is ensuring the continued provisioning of important ecosystem services. And so the threats to water security, as we've mentioned, are acutely manifested in island communities because of intrinsic vulnerabilities. And in particular, climate change impacts pose significant challenges to water supply, water quality, persistence of cultural practices, human health, and ecosystem services, as we see in this diagram. And the climate impacts to water infrastructure, which is essential to water security, will require different adaptation measures. So impacts from sea level rise differ from impacts from differing patterns of temperature and rainfall. So climate change poses significant threats to water quantity, quality, and water delivery. And so all these have important ramifications to well-being and economic development, as we saw in our diagram of water security early on. So, oops. Oh no. Oh. Okay, apologies everyone. Okay, so while climate change and chronic stressors affect water security, so there are all these ongoing issues such as overfishing, pollution that are affecting Hawaii and the US API. In particular, Hawaii and the US API face additional challenges from historical and current military activities. And so this is evidenced in Hawaii by the recent Red Hill contamination crisis. And this crisis has affected 93,000 residents, and we're well aware of, most of you have probably heard about this crisis. And this Red Hill contamination crisis has important and profound ramifications to human health, well-being, environmental health, food security, and the preservation of cultural practices. Another example is in Guam, and we're using the Andersen Air Force Base, which sits on top of a sole source aquifer. And this aquifer supplies drinking water to at least 70% of the island's residents, as well as residents on the Air Force Base. And this Andersen Air Force Base is a designated Superfund site by the Environmental Protection Agency. What does that mean? It means that there's long-term cleanup that's ongoing due to the continued presence of hazardous substances on the ground. Another example of this burden is in the Republic of the Marshall Islands, there's this, on Runit Island, there's this dome, the Runit Dome, or the coffin, as it's sometimes called. And this houses buried radioactive material from nuclear testing on Bikini and Enewetak atolls in between 1946 and 1958. And in American Samoa, there are World War II era above ground storage tanks that have led to significant petroleum contamination. And similar to Red Hill, these have profound ramifications to human health and the environment. And finally, I want to feature a study, recently published study by Dr. Eileen Alley and colleagues, which show the direct links of contaminants, public health, and food security. And this study is very timely because it addresses important data gaps on the effects of marine pollution in the Pacific Islands. And so the take-home message from showing all these examples is that there is an additional burden borne by Hawaii and the US API, and this additional cost burden elevates their vulnerabilities to water security challenges. And I'll pass it off to Chris to discuss having a closer look at American Samoa.
Yeah, thanks, Mia. And so I know that a number of the folks that are in the audience have been to American Samoa before. And I know a number of the folks that are in the audience are in American Samoa right now. And I do want to give a special thanks to those that are joining us from the American Samoa Governor's Office from American Samoa. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with the island chain, it's similar to Hawaii, a hotspot island chain in the Pacific, about halfway between Hawaii and New Zealand. And American Samoa is the eastern portion of the island chain, whereas just Samoa, it used to be called Western Samoa until 2009. But Samoa makes up the western half and is an independent nation. Next slide. And it is, unlike Hawaii, quite a bit more tropical. So it's located in the South Pacific Convergent Zone, which if you read old pirate books, that's the doldrums, where it's not very windy and it's super, super rainy. So there's a lot more rain on American Samoa, more thunderstorms. and then less trade winds as well in terms of climate. So it's a wet and tropical, beautiful jungly place. Next slide. And then in terms of what we're talking about, water contamination and transport, I'm a groundwater hydrologist. I would be remiss if I did not put a picture of the Guyman-Hertzberg lens in one of my presentations, something I learned to do in grad school. So here's our mandatory Guyman-Hertzberg lens. And really I put this in just, to kind of show the point that, and I think many of us have realized this through the Red Hill contamination crisis, that, no matter where you are, if you're on an island and you are standing on rock and not, wading in water, there is an aquifer that is below you, because the aquifers on these islands are essentially underneath all of the activities, all of the land uses, and all of the things that we do. And eventually, unless, the things that we're putting into the ground are mediated by, biological reactions, eventually they'll get to the groundwater. Eventually they'll get to the coast and affect things that are in between as well. So I'll turn it over to Mia to talk a little bit more about the surface water component of that.
Thanks so much, Chris. So here, this diagram, we take a closer look at this hydrological, biological, ecosystem health and services connections, and how, disruption to these links can potentially pose challenges to water security. And so here we hypothesize that terrestrial runoff and contamination sources that are carried by surface water and submarine groundwater discharge interacting with land use and land cover changes, climate change drivers. And this can directly impact, this ridge component can directly impact nearshore coral reef assemblages that are adjacent to these watersheds. And that the direction of these relationships, the magnitude and the strengths of these relationships between ridge and reef can directly impact food and water security in volcanic high islands like in American Samoa and many of the islands that we're talking about today. Chris?
Yeah, so we're going to kind of change gears and get into sort of out of our background here and into some of the case studies that we've experienced. And, like the topic of water security is like humongous and broad. And, essentially all of us at the Water Resources Center have worked on topics that relate to it. So, Mia and I, we can't do a full overview of the subject. But I think really what we can do is just share our experiences, share the things that we know, share the lessons that we've learned and the studies that we've done that, relate to this common thread. And so, as I was saying before, a lot of the studies that we've engaged in have really stemmed from the priority challenges of people that manage water resources, that manage land resources, marine resources. So here's kind of a big list of those priority challenges in American Samoa. Specifically today, we'll talk about some studies that address the declining reef health and ecosystem function issues, as well as drinking water security, focused on boil water advisory and whatnot, as well as a study that looks at climate impacts also. So, those are the studies that we will currently talk about, and that we've got, although there's many other studies, like I said, and there's more studies to do. So nobody's really done any work on the Ala legacy petroleum contamination in American Samoa. So that's a future study that needs to be done as well. The next slide. So getting into our own experiences, our own studies. This was a study that I started off in 2014, and this was kind of my introduction to looking at what's going on and trying to figure out how I can help. So this, I started doing this study during my master's project. It was not part of my master's to look at surface water hydrology, but when I was in American Samoa, there was a lot of talk from agencies, a lot of talk from the actual village of Whanga'alu itself. So this is the watershed of Whanga'alu. There's a village there, and folks were essentially worried about the condition of the fairly intact coral reef in the bay as it was being impacted by sediment and human activities. And so this was actually American Samoa's, it's one of the first priority watersheds. I don't know if it was exactly the first, but there's a lot of attention given to it. A lot of sediment work was being done at the time. And so we thought we would try to pitch in, and do what we could do with the tools that we had. So we took a number of nutrient samples, did seepage runs throughout the stream, and essentially assessed the fluxes of groundwater and nutrients. You can go to the next slide. Into the bay. So we looked at how much water is coming out, what the nutrient loads in that water was in terms of impacts. And then you can switch to the next slide as well. And we also looked at pesticide, herbicide, and pharmaceutical fluxes. And this was a study that was actually led by Eric Welsh. So he's a master's student in our department, graduated, I think, in about 2019. And he looked at these pesticides and herbicides. So these are his glyphosate or Roundup results in Fanga'alu, as well as on other parts of the island as well. So, one of the things that we were able to develop some results and communicate that to resource managers. But one of the things that we really did kind of learn with the start here is that to be more useful to managers, we realized that not just focusing on a single watershed or a single place was useful, but these folks were tasked with managing the entire territory, the entire island. And so doing studies that encompass that management area would be useful. So Mia will talk about our next study that did just that.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. So with support from the US EPA Wetland Program Development Grant, American Samoa EPA, together with local agencies such as Reef Advisory Group and the Department of Marine and Wildlife Resources, along with a federal agency such as National Marine Sanctuary of American Samoa and the University of Guam, we led the first Ridge to Reef framework study on Tutuila, looking at water quality and biological condition at a whole of island scale. So scales that are relevant to management units on Tutuila. And not only was this the first kind of cross governance initiatives, local and federal collaborations and partnership in academia, but this was also led by an all-women leadership team and women who led the fieldwork. So this is an all-women team of divers and people who collected water quality for a full year all over the island of Tutuila. So to me, that's pretty cool, and I wanted to highlight everyone's contribution in making that happen. So what did we learn? So in that study, we use dissolved inorganic nitrogen, so DIN for short, as a proxy of anthropogenically derived pollution. And so we measure the spatial and temporal variability of this nutrient for a full year across all watersheds on Tutuila. And what we can see here, this is Tutuila here on the top right of this figure, and we can see the different major watersheds that were sampled. And these circles represent DIN concentrations, so average DIN concentrations for each watershed. And the colors represent the reef types, as you can see here, for north, south, and wave sheltered reef classification. So the size of the circles correspond to concentrations. So the smaller the size of the circle, as we can see in Pangatele here, which is a National Marine Sanctuary of American Samoa site, it's quite small, so lower concentrations of DIN. And the bigger the circle, like in Aua, right here on Pongo Harbor, the higher the concentration. And we can also see that exemplified looking at the spatial variability of these DIN concentrations on the bottom figure here, this box plot. And so this type of information, this resulting information, enabled us to look at nutrient patterns across space and time and being able to compare that across watersheds and villages. And this type of exercise can help better refine management actions in American Samoa. And Chris will talk more about how those are applied.
And actually, my component in this project, I worked on this as well. It was basically to kind of extrapolate the results from the sampling to an island-wide extent through modeling. So essentially, I just took the non-point sources of DIN, OSDS locations, piggeries, and agriculture, as well as natural sources, and put those through. You can switch to the next slide. kind of a simple water budget-based nutrient loading model. So took those layers as well as fluxes of water, and then calibrated with the sampling results that Mia was just talking about to create, next slide, a DIN loading model for the whole island. And that was broken up by non-point source. So you can see on the top right, those are the OSDS concentrations of DIN that we model to be released out of those watersheds. So, again, this is handy science. We made some maps and whatnot, but, really to help managers and translate this into something that could be applied, we also took the extra step, and that Neil will talk about, to make this useful for management. And she'll talk about that now.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I would be remiss by not mentioning that Chris was a part of the Reef framework. This project ran for 4 years. And the first 2 slides that I showed with the all-women team of leaders, that was the first component of the team. So Chris, I'm sorry, I didn't add your pictures in the later on slides.
I was not a leader. Okay. I was just a modeler.
Okay, so extending that sort of like science link to management, right, as Chris said. So how did we use this type of information? So we looked at the DIN thresholds that we measured across all major watersheds for a full year, and use EPA guidance to model DIN to use EPA guidance and the biological data to predict when DIN exceeds and what percentage of those exceedances are for DIN concentrations across villages in American Samoa. And we can see here that each line is a village, and these are further classified based on American Samoa EPA watershed classification. So what does it mean? So what we came up with was a DIN criteria of 0.15 milligrams per liter threshold. And why is this type of science, academic science management exercise important? It's because this type of direct science to policy studies can have significant implications to protecting ecosystem health. DIN criteria, DIN is important because it's a highly bioavailable nutrient. So that means it can be easily taken up by organisms, such as in the reef. So there's a lot of nutrients. So that might potentially lead to higher uptake of nutrients, DIN and phosphates being one of them. And then that can potentially lead to higher preponderance of macroalgae cover that can disrupt, the balance on the reef and potential disruptions to reef health. And so DIN criteria is actually pretty rare in the United States. It's rare for states, both states and territories. And at the time that we did the study, there were only 2 states, Hawaii and Delaware, that have adopted this, and Puerto Rico being the other territory that has looked at establishing a DIN threshold. So this is quite relevant, especially to island communities in the Pacific. And so now we've kind of talked about the importance of nutrients and the ridge component. Then we want to see, how does this link to adjacent nearshore coral reef environments that provide important ecosystem services such as habitats to other reef organisms? And so we then look at what this relationship is. And here we show that the relationship, DIN, again, is a proxy for pollution. And we see its impacts. We wanted to see its impacts on the different biological indicators on the reef, such as reef fishes, benthic organisms, and coral. And we wanted to see, does it affect the condition of the species? How well does it affect? And what is the relationship of that effect? So here we see the effect of DIN is a significant driver of coral condition scores. And we can see here, I'll just use this top figure as an example. And we see that there is a direct negative relationship between dissolved inorganic nitrogen and coral condition score. So we can see that as DIN concentration increases on the x-axis, this goes from left to right. As it increases, we can also see a corresponding decrease in coral condition score, as we can see. For example, Fungatele, which right here, and in the previous map has really small circle signifying DIN concentration, but really high coral condition score. We can see that from Fungitelli with very low dissolved inorganic nitrogen. And as you increase that dissolved inorganic nitrogen concentration, then the scores, there's a decline. And so we then also further explored this relationship between water quality and benthic organisms. And so this multivariate analysis, this principal component analysis, just shows what these associations are. And so are there distinct associations between corals and other benthic biota to pristine, intermediate, or disturbed watersheds? These three watershed classes are based on human population densities. And this is defined by the American Samoa EPA. And this is the basic management unit for watersheds in American Samoa. And so here we can show that the association of things that are, kind of like positive for reef health, such as hard coral, in both shallow parts of the reef and deeper parts of the reef on the reef slope, we can see that there's associations of hard coral to pristine watersheds. Whereas things that are associated more with like a negative, kind of like a negative tick mark on the scoring of reef health, such as macroalgae, turf, and rubble, these are mostly associated with disturbed watersheds. So why is this important, and what is the core of the story? So why it's important is that there's like examining those relationships and those links between what's coming out of the reef onto your nearshore biota. And so we wanted to explore, what that means by looking at extending, do these relationships between terrestrial runoff and the benthic organisms, so your benthos, your habitat forming groups, do these also affect things beyond these habitats? So for example, do they affect important demographic processes? So we looked at recruitment. And so recruitment is just when fish transition from larvae stage and when they become babies or juveniles, and then they choose where in the reef they want to live and grow. So we looked at recruitment of reef fishes, and we use parrotfishes and surgeonfishes and examine the recruitment, because these herbivorous groups of reef fishes are really important ecologically. They play important ecological roles as bioeroders, and they're also really highly significant culturally and economically significant. So really high valued food fish in the Indo-Pacific. Okay, so what did we find? So we found that looking at the shallow parts of the reef and deeper parts, we see that recruitment, at least for these herbivorous reef fishes, occur primarily in shallow habitats. And they are most abundant. These juvenile fishes are most abundant in disturbed reef habitats. And we can see this pattern when we split it by family, by parrotfish and surgeonfish, and also by species. And then we also see that there's a lot more variation in the deeper reef slope. So why is this important? Why do we even care about this relationship between watershed characteristics and processes? It's important because recruitment can determine the abundance and composition of adult fishes. And if you're a fisheries manager, you might want to pay attention, because information about population dynamics will be important for food management and food security. And so that direct link between a mechanistic process, ecological process, and what's happening on the reef can inform us about management, and can better inform us on how we can take that information for water security issues and food security issues. I'll pass it off to Chris now to talk more about other issues.
Yeah, so now I'll shift quadrants a little bit from the ecological quadrant over to the drinking water security quadrant, and talk a little bit about a study that, again, this was a study that I did not plan to undertake until spending time at the water utility at ASPA and realizing that there was this boil water notice advisory, and that was essentially like the main problem in American Samoa for causing a lot of the issues that they were experiencing with customers, with EPA, and keeping their water system clean. So a little background on that. In 2009, which ended as an ongoing boil water advisory. From my understanding, lots of the system has been cleaned up from this and is no longer on boil water advisory, but some parts of the water system are still on boil water advisory over 10 years later. And this was caused by really a handful of wells that were identified by American Samoa EPA in the Tafuna area. And so, what they essentially were doing is they were taking turbidity and E. coli samples and sending that off to, I think it was Washington, D.C., to US EPA. Somebody was, checking it out, just sort of qualitatively looking at it and identifying, putting a red dot on the map and saying, this is a Goody well. Not really thinking about the mechanisms behind it. You can switch to the next slide. And excuse me, on that last slide, Goody meaning groundwater under the direct influence of surface water. So that's what I mean when I say Goody. So that's essentially surface water getting into the wells when it rains, which essentially changes the entire treatment dynamic. They have to treat it as surface water, which means flocculating it and treating it to a higher, or filtering it, treating it to a higher standard. So what I was able to do, again, ASPO was super open sharing with their data. They essentially handed over all of the turbidity and E. coli data, and they did a deep dive analysis looking at well by well, video logs of all these wells, looking at all these records to really understand what was going on down there in these Goody wells. And some consultants that they've had, sort of blamed the problem on well depth, things like that. But what we really found out was that it's actually the hydrogeology specifically in these areas. Each of these wells has a slightly different hydrogeology, and they react differently to rain events. And because of that, there's really not much that they can do except for treat the water. So using this information, they were able to go ahead with their plans to install kind of small microfiltration plants at the wells. And I think they're still working, ASPA is still working on carrying that out. So that was one study trying to address that issue. Another study that I ended up doing for my master's thesis was to try to look at land use impacts on the drinking water quality in these Goody well areas. So I used nitrogen, again, very similar to the DIN loading model that I talked about earlier, to model the transport of nitrogen through these aquifers and look at that as a proxy for human impacts at the drinking water wells. So that's in my master's thesis, if you want to look up more on that study. And then the next slide, I'll just change over to a little less water quality and talk about water quantity for just a second here. And as kind of everybody in the Pacific, everybody in the world is wondering, what's going to happen because of climate change, what's going to happen in the future. And as every real estate agent that I've ever talked to has said, well, if I had a crystal ball, I think, a lot of climate modelers say the same thing. But in American Samoa, it's a little bit easier because there's only one downscaled climate projection for the end of century. So we were able to essentially take that, incorporate it into the water budget model that I put together for American Samoa and look at how these water budget components like runoff and evapotranspiration, so obviously hotter temperatures, more evapotranspiration in the future, how that translates to things like water availability, which, the next step from precipitation is recharge to get to groundwater wells. And, as you can tell, the groundwater, more precipitation in the future would result in more groundwater recharge. And so we're able to quantify that for water managers to at least think about in their future water management. So not to say that this is the the only projection. A lot of the global projections differ a little bit. So we could do a similar study and take those into account as well. But this is just another example of how we can take science that seems far away from management and bring it a little bit closer. And I think we're going to talk about the big picture.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. So kind of just taking in some of the lessons, the lessons that we learned between Chris and I, we wanted to kind of provide 3 key themes that can be helpful to water resource management decision-making. And we developed this framework, which comprises 3 key themes: program planning, implementation, and evaluation. And so a lot of the things that we talked about, the importance of collaboration, the importance of defining scale and spatial temporal variability, and really working with relevant problems, defining what that problem is in collaboration with partners and collaborators in the area that we're working in. Those are really essential items and key to program planning, as well as collecting and compiling hydrological and biological data that are then relevant to the resource managers and stakeholders in your area. And so for implementation, communication of methods is really important, so that people are aware of what it is that you're doing. They're well aware of your objectives and how you're doing it, and also being adaptable, making use of what you have wherever you are. And lastly, evaluation. In this process, this element requires looking at whether you have done due diligence and whether your stated objectives that you've defined when you plan your program match the performance metrics. And this allows you to look at what are the outcomes, positive or negative, out of your project, and you can better share and be transparent about your results. And so we note that there are shared elements here. So good governance frameworks, resources, in a sense, is capacity, and the materials that you have and support are all key to the success of each team. And so lastly, we just wanted to bring to bear that context-dependent research that's rooted in place-based values is really essential to enabling actionable science links that can be useful to management. And by doing these, by looking at actionable science links to management, directly linking that is important to enhancing water security in the U.S. Pacific Islands region. Chris?
Yeah, so what did we learn? That was a great explanation, Mia. I think mine is a little bit simpler, my key message, a little bit more feel good. And really it's all about partnership. It's all about showing up in person, which in American Samoa, granted, is hard to do. There's only 2 flights a week. It's a long journey down there. But showing up and listening is really, one of the key things that I learned, at least, how to do. And I think it's really enabled my success in building a water-based research program in American Samoa. And then, just locally driven science-based approach to watershed management. I think that's a way that we can be successful and effective in addressing water security challenges moving forward. And you can switch to the next slide. And so, how do we increase these water science partnerships in American Samoa and Hawaii between the two? Well, I think one of them is just leveraging the existing networks that we already have. So we are really lucky to have kind of these tight professional networks of collaboration, of funding, and it's really great to see like 45 people showing up for this seminar because just like I was saying, I think it's great to see that people up to these things, have their interests, and then, like I said, I think listening, I think people, really do sort of keep their ears open and are interested in each other's work. And, that seems to really have driven a lot of the things that I've done.
Unmute. And just following up on Chris's point about leveraging networks and opportunities, there's much to be gained from bi-directional, knowledge exchanges between lessons we have learned and continue to learn from the Red Hook contamination crisis and an ongoing, data deficient problem in American Samoa, the Aua petroleum contamination. By leveraging the resources that we have in Hawaii, such as the university, we can really hopefully create meaningful knowledge exchanges between Hawaii and American Samoa. And Chris?
Yeah, and I think, one of the big things that we've done, I didn't talk about much during the projects, but in many of the projects that I do, we've always put in funds to include undergraduates at UH Manila or research interns at American Samoa Community College. It's been a really great way to engage not only the community and the interns, but, American Samoa is a small place. So it's like, I think half of our interns, have a family member or something that works at the agencies that we also work with. So everybody's, connected. And so bringing in students is just another great way to connect.
Great. And lastly, context, these are all context dependent water security challenges. And so what this means is that the risks and the resources that are available across, they're not evenly spread across Hawaii and the US API. And so understanding what these capacity gaps are and the potential barriers to collaboration is essential to establishing, strengthening, just meaningful and long-lasting partnerships. So we wanted to emphasize that it's really key to understand the context of the place that you're working and be flexible enough to adapt to that, these water security challenges. And so with that, we'd like to thank you all for listening and spending time with us for an almost 50-minute talk. Thank you for your attention. We'll be happy to answer any questions. And again, we just really highlight our collaborators, a lot of which are joining in from American Samoa. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining, and we acknowledge our funders. And with that, we'll open it to questions. Thank you again, everyone, for joining.
All right, thank you so much for that great talk. Clearly a lot of really good work's being done there. So I'd like to open up the floor for questions. As usual, you can answer your questions in the chat, but I'm also going to enable people to unmute and turn their video on shortly. If you're going to ask questions out loud, please do raise your hand using the Zoom setting first, so I can just make sure everyone is in order. So people should be able to unmute and show their videos now. Well, if maybe people need to get their thoughts together, I'll start off. So there was quite a bit of research highlights. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about maybe some of the mitigation actions that were taken in response to some of the results that came out of any of these projects, or like policy changes, anything like that.
I can take a crack at answering that. So I think one of the tangible outcomes is the collecting nutrient data from streams and reef flats across a full year, linking that to biological condition, and then being able to use that information on nutrient concentrations to suggest to the regulatory agency, to the territorial regulatory agency, ASEPA, say, hey, here's what we found, and this is how this information can be translated into a threshold. So a nutrient threshold, which can then be adopted into policies to regulate streams, water bodies in the territory. So I find that was one really meaningful outcome of our collaborative research.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I'll just take a crack too at that. I mean, I think it's kind of funny, when you're engaged really closely with folks. It's like, I've done a lot of these studies, written a lot of papers, written a lot of reports about groundwater sustainability. But then there's just these little opportunities where, for example, the other day, ASP was making a new drinking water master plan. And this is like a huge planning document for them. There's consultants that are building this for them. And they're like, can you review this? Give us feedback. And so, I put in 10 comments or whatever, and then all 10 of those comments are like absorbed into the master plan. And they're like, okay, these are the things that we're going to do for the next 20 years. So, it comes in funny places sometimes too, where you can make an impact.
I thought I saw Tom raise his hand earlier.
Yeah, thank you for that great talk. Chris and Mia, both of you have worked, as we now know, extensively in American Samoa, and now you've recently been working in Hawaii. So I just wondered if you had some insights on, kind of similarities and contrasts in water quality issues in the two island groups, and and are there things we can learn that we can apply in Hawaii from research done in American Samoa and vice versa?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that last step. So yeah, I mean, I think American Samoa, one of the biggest differences that I noticed is just really the scale. Hawaii is a lot larger. There's a much larger population. It's geographically larger. When we take samples, water quality samples, there's like more influences that are influencing those samples. Whereas in American Samoa, sometimes there's places where I'm like, I know there's one cesspool here and it's boosting the Delta 15N value of the coastal water like crazy. And it's like one family's house. It's really the small scale, which makes it a really great research laboratory. So I think a lot of the things that we learn, a lot of the methods that we've developed in American Samoa can definitely be applied to bigger places and really just kind of scale up. But we're just so much more nimble a lot of the times when we're working at a smaller scale that it's a great test lab to work on these methods.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that as well that scale is certainly an issue. Like there's a lot of similarity, right? There's a lot like high island dynamics and the ecological signatures and the connectivity between land and sea. Those are shared similarities with Hawaii, between Hawaii and American Samoa. There's also shared culture, Polynesian culture between the two places. There's a really big link between American Samoans living in Hawaii. There's a big Samoan population in Hawaii. There are these similarities. And so that also comes with some similarities and so some shared challenges to water security. But I'd like to highlight one major difference, which is the governance framework. So this is a territorial, American Samoa is a US territory. And so there is the territorial government. So I guess it's akin to, the state of, but there's also village-based governance. So they're the chiefs. Village chiefs are very important, and then they have oversight of their villages, and so that really strong governance systems and and understanding those different frameworks, village-based, territorial, and then federal. And so how do those all interplay? I think it's a really one of the big differences, and there's a lot that we can learn in terms of the way that these places are managed.
Thank you.
We have a raised hand from Ali.
Thank you very much, Chris and Mia, for the talk. It was super interesting. I was wondering, did you study the impacts of the OSDS to the reef development? And how do you, if it's the case, how do you consider such a pollution into the groundwater? Do you consider it's just like a release of a contaminant into the groundwater? Or do you think that part of OSDS, this pollution, can be stored in the ground before to be released into the groundwater?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I was just talking about at the Hawaii State Legislature, the impact of OSDS and cesspools in Hawaii on the coastal zone as well. I think it's pretty well studied at this point how on-site disposal systems and specifically cesspools impact the nearshore. And generally the main things that we look at and that are indicators are really nutrients and bacteria. And the main nutrient is nitrate, and that's a pretty conservative molecule, and it moves fairly quickly through the groundwater because it's or not quickly, but it moves at the same speed as the groundwater. It doesn't bind up to sediments like phosphate does, for example. So it moves conservatively through as fast as the water can flow. Does that answer your question?
Yes, completely. Thank you.
I'll just add one thing into what Chris said. It's not necessarily related to on-site disposal systems, but relevant to American Samoa are piggeries. And so piggeries back in, maybe 10, 15 years ago was a big problem, right? And so EPA instituted a dry litter program. This was in coordination with other local agencies, as well as the NRCS, so the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So looking at the impacts of piggeries and also like planning for where those piggeries are located. So what they found was that these piggeries are right next to streams. And so what they've done is instituted, you know, like there's this setback of where piggeries are concentrated, and you're not allowed to spray your piggeries and just let it flow into the stream where it will flow into the ocean. So that what they've done is like they looked at EPA did stream monitoring, and they realized that there's a lot of nitrogen across the streams, and they could trace it back to the source of piggeries. And so they instituted that sort of like policy to mitigate that issue.
And it's not just in Samoa. There's a piggery next to my house in Haiku, Maui, as well. It has 200 pigs in it. We have the same issues in Hawaii.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So I see Aurora.
Okay, Tom asked, thanks both for, I know both of you, but it's nice to hear what your research was in America and Samoa. I guess I was thinking kind of along the lines of Tom's question, but a little bit different. Can you speak a little bit on the nature of partnerships in American Samoa and opportunities for partnerships in Hawaii? Like, how do they compare? And I know you said the governance structure is different, but you know, just your thoughts on where things could maybe go to be more truly rich to reef.
Yeah, that's I can take a crack at that. Thank you very much, Aurora, for the question. Really interesting and really insightful. First, I'd like to acknowledge that there are many American Samoa agency resource managers and regulatory people that are on this call. So they they're probably better versed to really comprehensively answer that. But from our perspective, from our understanding based on our work there, I think, as Chris mentioned before, scale that plays to the advantages. Everyone knows each other, and that I could walk to Coral Reef Advisory Group and say, hey, I wanted to talk to you about reef issues. How can we institute that among these different agencies? So having that really already close connections that are existing between different local government agencies is really key. And in addition, there's also really close partnerships with federal agencies in American Samoa. So I think there's that connections and similarities in Hawaii, and especially the work that WRRC does. And with respect to the governance structures and what can we learn, there's an Office of American Samoa Affairs, and for any work that's being conducted, you have to talk to Office of American Samoa Affairs, and they coordinate these projects, not just researchers, but even government projects. You can't just go to a village and do something without the villagers' permission and the chief's permission. So having, I think, that context of how things flow and what's acceptable and any potential barriers that we might not be aware of, I think those are some of the things that we can take to Hawaii and also learn from American Samoa, and also, yeah. So that's sort of from my perspective. And Chris, I'd open that to you as well.
I think you did a great job answering it. Thanks, Mia. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, now I said that was the last question, but I see Lisa there, and I want to give her a chance to speak. So go ahead, Lisa.
Hello?
We can hear you, Lisa.
Okay, hey, thank you very much. That was a really great presentation. But I just wanted to add on with regards to, I'm sorry, we got cut off and I had to jump right back on, but I missed what you were saying prior to. Thank you very much for a great presentation, Mia and Chris. Really very informative and great work. I just wanted to add on that with regards to having anything work-wise here in American Samoa, it's always best to reach out to the governor's office, and then they can let us know and coordinate accordingly. We do have the Hazard Mitigation Council, the Resilience Office, the Governor's Resilience Office, and we have American Samoa Resilience Commission. All of these, we are these are all partners so that we are to avoid having to duplicate efforts and to encourage working together, fostering working relationships, and that we can maximize partners through partnerships on the sharing of information, and especially this really good study that you have already completed thus far. I see Areto on the call that he is from AACC, a land grant, and we can always learn from each other. But as far as partnership and the government structure, yes, by going out into the village communities, you can go to the Office of Samoan Affairs and they will coordinate what you need to have done in the villages accordingly. But I do say that from here on forward, and in order for information to have one point of contact, is always best to reach out to the governor's office, because that's how we were able to find out about this really great educational presentation done today, or meeting, was from the governor's office. They had shared the information with ourselves, GROW office, AACC, and how we're able to get people from American Samoa on the call. I wish we had met you earlier and have known about what you were doing and the great work that you've done so far. We could have had really good sharing of information and the resources. You can visit our website. It is odapam.as.gov, and then you can find out how, you can use some of the resources, the tools, or the resources that are available on our site. But thank you so much. It was really refreshing to hear about today's presentation. Thank you for my time.
Malo lava, Lisa, and Paaptai lava. It's really great that there's a coordinating agency or a body within the governor's office, and we will, we will continue to build on those relationships. And hopefully, this isn't, the last. Hopefully, this is a springboard for many more opportunities for us to work together.
Thank you.
All right, I think we should wrap it up there. So I'll let you all go ahead. And thank you to our speakers one more time. Really glad we were able to have you as part of our seminar series.
Thanks, everybody.
Lava. Thank you. Thank you very much.